this done. Oh jeez, I've been here for way too long. But at least I can wait. Stop! Please! Let go of me, you stupid! Please! Help!
My head. What the heck happened? Last thing I remember was a forest? No, that doesn't make any sense.
Hello, Mr. Death.
Huh? Someone's talking?
You may be wondering where you are right now, and the answer to that may frighten you.
Hold it. I'm gonna stop you there. That's not my name.
Would you rather I called you by your real name?
Fair point. Fine, so why exactly did you take me here? I think I was in the middle of something, and I think I've got a massive bruise on my head right now.
Would you like to play a game?
I think that's what I was doing before you brought me here. Wait, are you trying to do a Jigsaw parody?
That's none of your business.
It's not the worst impression I've heard.
Well, I think... No, that's not the point. You have made some grievous decisions in your life, neglecting others in the process. And because of this, I have decided to see if you are worthy of keeping your life. Over there is a computer. And don't try and send messages for help. If you try, this room will fill with water and you will drown.
Wouldn't I be electrocuted first?
Don't be a smartass. Your task is simple. Complete it in one day, and I will let you live. Fail, and you will know the pain you have caused others.
Okay, but what exactly did I do?
You talked bad about my favorite game of all time.
Are you serious? You put me in a situation where I could die, simply because I talked bad about your favorite game.
When you put it like that, it sounds sillier than it is. Anyway, your task is this. Make a video saying that this game is not that bad.
Okay, so what game is this? Are you kidding me? You know the reputation that game has. I've even pointed it out before, and I was nice in how I talked about it. I could have been much harsher like everyone else was.
But your points about it are exactly why I chose you.
But there are already a ton of videos out there pointing out its flaws. Why did you choose me?
Because you could be nicer than them. I hope.
And you won't let me out until I do this, right?
Correct.
Fine, let's get this started.
So, you're back. Have you finished the video?
Sorta. I need to run something by you first.
Okay, what are you talking about?
Look, I can't do it. I've spent countless hours researching this, and I can't see a way to make the video you want me to make.
So you're saying you'd rather die?
No, not at all. While I can't make the video you're looking for, I can at least do something close to it. But for that, I need your help.
My help? What?
Just listen and hear me out, okay?
Fine. This had better be worth my time.
Like, I can't make those kinds of promises, but I can at least make this interesting.
Okay. Proceed.
Okay, so, Marvel's Avengers. This game has been trashed on. A lot. And with somewhat of a good reason. But I want to look at this from a different point of view. To analyse this game from a different perspective. Not necessarily what went wrong, since someone has probably already beaten me to it, but it will be in that general kind of area. And we'll at least look at a few of the problems that the game had. And with the game reportedly getting no future content after 2023, I figured it was a good time to start talking about it. Effectively, I wanted to ask one question. Could it have succeeded? Did this project have any chance of doing well, or was it just a dud from day one? To do that, I need to address some of the core problems with the game. Okay, quick. Think of a superhero game off the top of your head. Go.
Batman Arkham City.
Good choice. Now think of a different one.
Batman...
Nope, we already said a Batman game. Think of another one.
Marvel Spider-Man.
The old one or the new one?
Either.
Okay, name one more for me.
Infamous.
Odd choice, but it does come under the superhero category. Now, all three of those games have something in common. They are all open world / area. Meanwhile, Marvel's Avengers doesn't really have that. Yes, their levels are big and you can certainly go practically anywhere in each level, but there's next to no point. Its open world aspect is just narrow and bland, with very little reason to do anything else, other than just go to the next objective. I mean, all three of the games you mentioned had stuff to do in each level, or outside one, such as collectibles, side quests, and random action you could enjoy outside of a level, especially like in the Batman games where you could just beat random goons on the street. And while Marvel's Avengers does have some of these aspects, like collectibles, there's no real incentive to actually get them. Whereas in the others, there was, such as grabbing random power cores in Infamous could increase your power and make you stronger, or solving random puzzles would unlock the Riddler in Batman.
Ugh, don't remind me. Oh wait, that's not fair. There have been hundreds of superhero games that weren't open world area. Look at Injustice or Marvel Ultimate Alliance. They weren't either of those, and they still were successful and mostly beloved by their respective fan bases.
And that is a valid point. However, those examples in itself prove the issue, or at least one of the issues. Injustice was made to be a fighting game, and Ultimate Alliance was intended to be an action RPG. Marvel Avengers, to me, felt like it was meant to be a different game from the start, but was forced to be an open world game. Like if a cheeseburger tried to be a steak. Even if the cheeseburger did somehow become a steak, it still wouldn't really have the same qualities that a steak has. Either that, or the open world part just didn't get developed enough to work.
That's a weird analogy, but I'll let it slide.
Yes, I understand the different levels aspect of it, but take a look at some similar games that did the same thing, but better. The LEGO games, which have a similar formula to what the Marvel's Avengers game did. Heck, they made an Avengers game themselves, and while they did have a kind of level aspect that Marvel's Avengers has, they still made the areas feel big and alive, and they had a hub world that felt expansive and added to the games. Take for example one of the LEGO game's most recent ones, DC Supervillains. That hub world felt big and well, not amazing, but expansive. It felt like there was always something to do other than just going around, just going to the next mission. And the levels themselves in those games always felt interesting and engaging to play, whereas the ones in Marvel Avengers felt somewhat dull most of the time, almost copied and pasted at times. If you're going to make an Avengers game and not have it be open world, or any game with levels for that matter, it needs to have interesting levels and stuff to do, otherwise you're just going to leave players feeling bored. And something that feels boring to be involved in is something you want to avoid at all costs when making a project. Especially something like a video game. Now, as to how you would do that, I don't know. I'm not a video game developer. But the whole point of a video game is to immerse a player in said game. And if they feel bored, that immersion goes right out the window. And you leave them with something that is just unsatisfying to play. Now here's where a fair amount of criticisms of the game seem to stem from, based off my research. It's called a thing called games as a service.
Games as a what now?
Well, think of it like this. A game's income usually comes primarily from the game being bought by consumers, right? So how do you keep that income coming in when no one seems to buy the game anymore?
Paid DLC or something?
Exactly. This is referred to as games as a service, where a game has other ways to get its player base to spend money, even after the game has been out for a long time. You know of mobile games that are notorious for getting players to spend money through in-app purchases or the like. Either to get a leg up in the game or just to have a JPEG of a half-naked character blush or squeal at you.
Do people actually spend money for that?
Yeah, there's probably a topic to cover in the future, although I'm not looking forward to that.
Did you actually have to play that to record this part?
Please don't remind me of that. Please. Anyway, Marvel's Avengers has the same system, where it has other ways to make money. Now, in hindsight, this isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Wait, really? Why not?
Well, when a game has been bought by all its consumers, it's generally not going to make any more money, right?
Right.
So if a game sold poorly, or people want more of what they bought, you're left with a couple of choices. Option 1, you cut your losses and move on to your next project. This can leave some fans disappointed, but it can be a good decision business-wise and lets you learn from your mistakes.
Seems reasonable.
Option 2, you make a sequel of the game to draw on what people liked about the original, and make more money that way. Although that does mean you need to use more and more resources to make said sequel, while running the risk of said sequels failing. You could say that this is what the franchise you're apparently from did with their series.
I'll ignore that last part. Go on, what's number 3?
Option 3... Well, option 3 is to make DLC, or other things that people can spend their money on. While DLC does not necessarily need to be obtained with money, as the first DLC seems to be for games like Splinter Cell and Ninja Gaiden, and were free, it is becoming more and more common for DLC to cost money to obtain. These can be little stories that can give more depth to the game's world, or expand on the character's backstory, such as Ellie in the first Last of Us game, or Freedom Cry in Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Other times, it can completely change the way a game is played, such as the DLC for Animal Crossing New Horizons, or the expansions in the many Civilization games. There's also gacha or loot box stuff, but that is way too big to cover in this video, and probably requires a whole separate video to look properly at it. However, just because a game has DLC does not mean that it falls under the game as a service category. Only if said game consistently puts out this content or other things into the game that require you to pay to access them. GTA 5 is a good example of this, since it has made many features in DLC that require you to pay to play them, yet it is still going strong a decade later.
If we ignore the issues that Rockstar's come up with in that time.
Yeah, but that's not what we're focusing on here. Now, Marvel Avengers did do the third option through its DLC, giving players a chance to play as characters who did not appear in the original story, like Black Panther or Hawkeye. And these did decently, with many seemingly praising the DLC for Hawkeye and Black Panther from my research.
I can already sense a plot.
You're right. There's one other kind of DLC that I didn't mention, one that Marvel had in the game on top of the DLC stories that they made. The horror that is known as cosmetics. Those who don't know, cosmetics in-game basically let players change the original costume that an in-game character has, and it allows for players to change how they look in the game.
Most people on the internet know about this stuff. Get to the point.
I am. See, in-game cosmetics by themselves aren't inherently a bad thing, and can be a way to effectively congratulate the player for playing, or to celebrate a specific event, such as Christmas. You see this all the time in games, especially in ones with battle passes such as Smite, Dead by Daylight, or Fortnite. However, other times these cosmetics can only be obtained through paying actual money, and players are less likely to buy these cosmetics unless they like spending a lot of money to change a freaking JPEG, or just want to brag to other online players about their cool skin. It's just really dumb, and I still don't really get it.
That was a bit forceful. You okay?
What? Yeah, I'm fine, just remembering some stupid decisions from my past. Anyway, for a Marvel game, having different cosmetics is fine. Heck, even paid cosmetics can be fine if done correctly. I mean, it's Marvel. They have so many different kinds of costumes they can add. It just works business-wise, and it makes sense to do from a business perspective.
Oh dear, I can already see where this is going.
Yeah. The developers, or Marvel, or whatever, I'm not sure who. But they doubled down on this aspect hard. From what I can find, every single cosmetic can only be obtained through either buying the currency to get the cosmetic, through the battle pass, getting extremely lucky while on a mission, or from a loot box,
Uh-oh.
or you just grind constantly to get enough currency, which takes forever just to get the costume. Never mind the fact that on top of cosmetics there's emotes, finishing moves, nameplates, the list goes on. You can already see the problem. For casual people, they either don't have enough time to grind that much currency, or they just don't want to invest hours and hours of playtime just to get one cosmetic. And while that sort of currency system can work for hardcore players, the grind is still tedious, since the premium currency is different to the in-game one, meaning you're working with two different currencies on top of the currency that is needed to upgrade gear.
That could be a good thing. I bought a Fortnite costume with my mom's credit card the other day and didn't have enough currency left over for my playtime to buy some more emotes.
Why were you playing? You know what? I don't want to know. And if you start doing a dance, I'm gonna leave. And you are right. 2 or 3 currencies could work in hindsight, and grinding is just an aspect of the game that happens all the time. But not when the only way to get one of the currencies is to pay with actual money, and the other is tedious as all hell to grind in the first place. Because there are other games out there that still have a grinding aspect to them for a currency, but they're a lot more lenient in how much they give. Avengers isn't. And consider this. Someone calculated how much money would be needed to get all the cosmetics in the game. Guess how much it was?
I'm afraid to ask.
$3,000.
Sorry, what?
You heard me right, $3,000 according to articles from November 2021. And that was a year ago. Who knows how much it is now? And that brings me back to the games as a service issue. Just because a game falls under this category doesn't make it bad. Heck, look at games like Grand Theft Auto 5 that is still going strong a decade later.
And like 50 remasters for each console.
True, but this is because GTA has so much to do. A decent single player campaign, a wide area to explore in its multiplayer, dozens of heists, who knows how many cosmetics that can be bought through in-game currency, which from what I've seen is much more comfortable to grind, and dozens of game modes within its multiplayer like Capture the Flag or Golf. Marvel's Avengers doesn't really have any of that, besides the DLC stories that can be beaten under 4 hours, and a multiplayer mode that apparently everyone hates. You shouldn't have your cosmetics be effectively the only content that you put out. However, I will give Avengers the benefit of the doubt, since GTA has a vastly different multiplayer system.
That's kind of dumb.
True, but at this point, we should probably move on to what I hope is the last point I want to make, because talking about the multiplayer would take way too long, and I haven't actually been able to play it, so it's finding players is, not easy. Maybe I'll cover it in more depth at some point if you want.
We shall see.
So what could be my last main point about this game? Well, it has to do with the game's story and its innovation.
That's 2 things.
I know, but work with me here for a sec. The story is not bad, honestly. It does do its job. However, for a Marvel product, it feels, weak?
Huh?
Well, I'll effectively sum up the story and you can stop me if you've heard it before. So a teenage girl, Kamala Khan, gets invited to Avengers Day, which is a day to celebrate the Avengers as a team. But something goes wrong and the Avengers are blamed for the mess that happens, so they disband and go into hiding. 5 years later, if I'm correct, Kamala Khan manages to get them back together for one final fight against the real enemy. They fight them and eventually win, assembling the Avengers team again once the threat is defeated. I am generalizing here, but it is the basic gist of the game.
That sounds a little like Avengers Endgame.
Well, not exactly, but it does have similar themes. Avengers at a low point, time passes, incident happens, another team up to save the world.
Hold up, that's not fair. Stories have to have low points of the incidents to create tension. Does that mean that something like Civil War or Age of Ultron is in the same boat?
Not quite. Here's the thing. Endgame came out in 2019, while the game came out 1 year later. And yet the game itself was announced 2 years before Endgame even came out, which surprised me. I expected it to be announced after Endgame came out. That would have made a lot more sense business-wise. According to Bill Roseman, a creative at Marvel Games, the story was aiming to take a tone similar to the Marvel's comics in the 90s, aiming to look at superheroes from a regular person, which was meant to be Kamala. He wanted the story to be grounding in a way, to be a grounded, human, accessible, believable, relatable story. That's a quote from him. Which is probably why they collaborated with Crystal Dynamics, whose best game they have been credited with were the Tomb Raider reboots, which did get praise for the game's story pacing and depth to the characters. And in a way it worked. Sort of.
What do you mean?
Well, the story does try to have a heavy focus on Kamala, and it is definitely refreshing to see the Avengers from a perspective outside the Avengers themselves, since to this date the only one that I know of that did this that wasn't a comic was Civil War. I mean, originally this section was meant to be about how I thought Marvel picked the wrong company to outsource and collaborate with. And in a gameplay aspect, that is partly true, and maybe they should have picked someone else for the gameplay of Marvel's Avengers. But Crystal Dynamics kind of helped the game's story work as a whole. It was definitely interesting to see Kamala be what was effectively a superfan trying to learn what it was like to have powers, and to see a believable shift from superfan to superhero, and I really enjoyed its inclusion in the story. And yet, nothing else about the game of Marvel's Avengers stands out in terms of story. There's nothing to make it interesting, nothing that innovates or changes what we already know about the Avengers. I mean, we already saw an Iron Man at their lowest point in Endgame, where the game Iron Man acts a bit too similar to the one in Endgame. Why not change up the situation or how these characters react in said situation?
Well, that's not fair, they're both the same character.
Fair, but their circumstances are different. One is alone while the other has had time to grieve and also has a kid. And yet they still somehow feel a bit too similar in how they act in their respective sources. Also, consider that while we know who the people in the Avengers are, we don't really connect with any of them. Interestingly, it's also the exact same mistake that DC made with Justice League. They made a movie involving characters that we know from their comics, and yet spend most of the movie assuming that we know that, and as a result give no real depth to their characters, leaving newcomers confused as to who these characters are or why we need to care about them. Marvel's Avengers makes this mistake as well. Despite most people knowing who these characters are, there isn't really any time throughout the game, excluding Easter eggs, giving depth to them. With the only one really getting any depth to them is Kamala, who I remember a lot of people being kind of upset of her inclusion when it was announced.
Because she doesn't have a lot of popularity and she could go to someone more important like Hawkeye, right? Because he was in the first Avengers movie.
I mean, maybe, I'm not sure, that could have been part of it. But frankly, I reckon what they should have gone for with this game was to make it a Kamala Khan game solely, while keeping the premise somewhat the same. Having Kamala have to learn what it means to actually be a hero to keep that grounded factor, while still having Avengers show up to help sell that superfan effect that Kamala would be experiencing from meeting them. Maybe have some of her missions involve specific Avengers to help give them character development and depth. Then they can make an Avengers game after establishing these characters in the same universe. Now, would it have sold well? Unlikely, since most people probably didn't know who Kamala is at the time. Although maybe they could have decided to release it around the same time the MCU TV show came out, which would have helped garner attention to her and probably would have helped sell it better.
Wait, didn't Batman v Superman do that though? The whole make a character film before going for a team up? Remember how that turned out?
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Well, this has been good and all, but I asked you to defend this game, not ramble on for who knows how long about the game's issues.
True, but that's exactly my point.
What?
Look, even if the story was excellent, if the multiplayer was great, if the games as a service mechanic worked, and even if the suitability of the game worked, I still don't see a way that this game would have done well. Like a Kamala Khan solo game maybe would have been able to fix the problem, but it wouldn't have gotten them nowhere near to the amount of resources that they put into the game.
Excuse me? You do realize what you're saying, right? I could just end this right now.
And you'd probably be completely justified doing that. But I want to point out that, honestly, this game never had a chance of doing well to begin with.
Explain. And this better be good.
Look, when I was doing my research for this video, one important detail kept popping up over and over. That there may simply just be too much superhero media going around nowadays. See, I took a look at the movies that Marvel has made over the last 20 years to look at the growth of the MCU and see if there was any correlation in terms of if it compared to the game. And the numbers were interesting. To start, I looked at the amount of money that these movies made and compared them to their average review score to see if there was any correlation between these two factors. For now, I wanted to only look at the films that are definitely part of the MCU, so Sam Raimi's trilogy and the Garfield films won't count yet, despite being in No Way Home. I could also discuss the X-Men films, but as they don't really play a part in the MCU yet, or have that much of an impact on the game, they won't be looked at as in-depth here.
Hey, spoilers.
Phase 1 of the MCU, critically wise, was somewhat mixed, with Rotten Tomatoes rating these movies highly, being mostly in the high 70s to low 90s. While Metacritic and IMDb generally had these films rated in the low 60s and 70s. At the same time, these films also generally made the lowest money of the MCU films, with the obvious outlier being the first Avengers film.
Okay, but they were just getting started, right? It's like yelling at a baby who's still learning to walk and they can't ride a bike yet.
Not even going to ask, but you are correct. And besides, there wasn't a massive amount of interest in the superhero movies yet, since there did seem to be a large gap between when they were released, both on the Marvel side with 5 films, not counting Hulk, being released in the span of 4 to 5 years, and the DC side where they mostly focus on their animated films, since their live action ones didn't usually hit well. So let's move on to Phase 2, when the MCU started to actually be built, and when DC decided to try and make more live action superhero movies to try and keep up in popularity. The Phase 2 films started to be more consistently better, with most of the films getting generally positive films similar to Phase 1. Grossing wise, however, was a different story. Phase 1's lowest grossing film made 264 million, whereas the lowest in Phase 2 was 644 million. That is over 2 times the lowest one in Phase 1 did, and beats everything in Phase 1 money-wise except for the Avengers. Want to guess which one that was?
A soldier?
Nope, it was Thor: The Dark World, which is the second worst MCU film to date going off reviews. Yes, I know that reviews can be fixed and whatnot, but it is a good base for this research since combining grossing and review scores gives us a basic idea of how desirable superhero movies are. And so far the numbers are consistent. The grossing generally matches up with how they scored review-wise. Meanwhile, DC was still struggling to make a name for themselves here, only releasing one live-action film over this period of time, that being Man of Steel. But then we get to Phase 3, and this is where I think the issues start, even before the Avengers game got announced. Phase 2 had only 6 movies released over the course of 2 to 3 years. Phase 3 made 11 movies over 3 years, with Civil War kicking it off and ending with Far From Home.
Wait, only 3 years? It felt like so much longer.
I agree, and this isn't even counting the ones that weren't part of the MCU, like the X-Men or Fan 4 Stick. DC also decided to chip in here, making around 7 movies over this same time span. So we are looking at around 20 to 30 superhero movies over the course of 3 years, not counting animated ones.
Holy crap.
And this is where I think the Avengers game problems mainly lie. There's just too much of it. And I'm not the only one to suggest this. See, when making a project like a film or a TV show or a game, supply and demand have to be considered, and that changes how the project should be made. To simplify it, supply and demand is how much you can make it versus how many people want it. But let's go back to Phase 3 to demonstrate this. Nearly every single film in Phase 3 made more than what the ones in Phase 1 and 2 did, with its lowest just barely losing to Thor: The Dark World. And 5 of these films made over $1 billion worldwide, only being done before by Iron Man 3 in the first 2 Avengers films. And the reviews also matched this grossing amount, earning high 80s and low 90s for the most part on Rotten Tomatoes, and around the 80 mark on Metacritic. Heck, even DC, for the amount of movies in this period of time they made that bombed critically, they still made at least $350 million at worst.
Wow, so people really wanted to see superhero stuff on the big screens, didn't they?
Yep, even if the movie sucked, they still knew that they could gamble on making one, regardless of whether or not it would make them money back. I mean, take a look at all of DC's stuff during this time. Despite being critically bad and just disliked by most audiences, they still made a large amount of money. More than what most films would make, more than what most films would generally make. But then we get to Phase 4, which is around the time that the Avengers game got released. Now, before you say anything, no, this is not a Phase 4 review. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm simply looking at the background information to help get an idea of why this game just couldn't work. So, anyway, Phase 4 is where I saw a lot of criticism about the MCU start to kick off.
But that's because all the movies suck, right?
That's what I thought at first, but then something didn't add up. Take the money for example. Up until now, the money it made at the box office was pretty consistent over the last 3 years, being usually around a specific amount and usually hovers around there, usually sometimes going up, sometimes going down, but it would usually hover around that area. With Phase 4, that's not the case. There are a number of outliers here, with Black Widow and Eternals being on a significantly low end and No Way Home being on a significantly high end.
But again, can't we just put that down to lack of quality?
Partly, since Eternals and Black Widow didn't do amazing review-wise. But look at this. Shang-Chi, a movie that seemed to be well received by critics and audiences, did worse box office-wise than 2 movies that did worse review-wise.
But those are sequels, so of course fans of the previous ones will watch those regardless. That's not a fair comparison.
I agree.
You do?
Yeah, Shang-Chi didn't have much of a foundation before, so of course less people would see it because they didn't know much about him or what the movie is aiming for. However, let's take another look at Black Widow, who is a pretty well-established character in the MCU, being one of its core members. You would think that because of this, people would turn out to see her film, even if the film wasn't amazing. And yet, it somehow made less money than Eternals, which is seen as one of the worst films in the MCU, that could partly be due to COVID. Not sure. And I think I know why there's such a discrepancy with Phase 4, and it relates back to the Avengers game. Well, people have superhero fatigue. Remember that supply and demand I talked about earlier? When the supply of a project goes up, the demand goes up as well. In turn, that also raises the quality that the project needs to be at to gather attention. It's like a Super Saiyan bargain sale. When there's more Saiyans running around with the same exact form, people expect the new form to be compelling, or the next transformation to look good, or the next Saiyan to be interesting. Otherwise, you run the risk of losing the audience interest.
Oh, I think I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, when there's too much of something, people are usually going to gravitate towards either what they know they like, hence the outliers like Doctor Strange and Thor, Love and Thunder, or something that breaks the norm and gets people's attention. That's partly why shows like Invincible have done so well. They are something completely different to what else is out there, and they have good writers for the most part. The Avengers game didn't really have those aspects at all. It didn't have the actors from the MCU that people grew to love, so it was going to struggle to bring in people who love the characters or actors from the MCU. And it didn't have that unique aspect that would make it stand out, especially when the trailers seemed to tell a story that people had probably heard about before in another medium. Heck, Stefan, a former general manager of the company who helped produce Marvel Avengers, was in an interview about some of the company's games that had come out recently. He then went on to talk about the superhero genre and the failure of Marvel's Avengers, stating that, quote, "They still get a lot of attention, but it's starting to get boring, especially in games. Few people have managed to release successful projects with superheroes. There's always Batman from the guys at Rocksteady, there's Spider-Man. But among all the people who have done this sort of thing, the success of superhero games hasn't been very good." And he's not wrong. Yes, superhero games like Spider-Man and the Arkham series have sold very well. But when talking about best-selling games or the best games of all time, superhero games don't always enter that conversation. Those two are usually just outliers. And in regards to those games, like the recent Marvel Spider-Man games, those games used the character, but told stories and had gameplay that hadn't really been done before, since I don't actually know if the Spider-Man games were based off anything or any comics, and the gameplay of those games were very fine-tuned and polished, making them stand out as video games. In the Arkham series, they were effectively their own separate continuity, so they were going to be interesting regardless, as well as having gameplay that was just enjoyable from start to finish.
Minus the Riddler trophies.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. The Avengers game, however, was never going to work like that because there was already too much Avengers-related stuff beforehand. From the movies to the comics, having the game hit these two crucial marks that I mentioned before was going to be pretty much impossible, simply because the market's just too saturated with Avengers content. Any story they would have come up with would have been bound to be related to a past model, either in the form of comics, movies, or another medium. And unless it managed to be something completely unexpected in the process and had very polished gameplay, it wasn't going to sell like they thought it would. And sadly, that spelt doom for the game before it had even been finished. So now what? I know I didn't do what you asked, but I feel like I did a decent job with this.
You know what? I liked it.
Wait, what?
It wasn't what I wanted, but it was entertaining enough for me to leave you be. For now.
You do realize you didn't need to threaten me, right? You could have just called me or something.
Ah, but where's the fun in that? Anyway, you still got a playthrough to finish, right? I'll let you go do that, but don't be surprised if you end up here again.
Should I be concerned?
Are you questioning my authority?
Fine. I'm going. I'll see you later then.